Good morning, year 12s. Let us look into the text longest memory. When you look into the text, there is an epigraph at the very beginning. If I don't know whether you have heard the word epigraph. Let me write it for you. Epigraph. So epigraph is actually a quote at the beginning of a piece of writing. Any quote, a quote at the beginning of a piece of writing is called epigraph. And here we have got two epigraphs. The first one is from Zora Neale Hurston, and it is the phrase from that is, "I have been in sorrow's kitchen and licked out all the pots." That particular phrase or that particular part of that epigraph is actually preparing us for the novel's great sorrow. So that Zora is actually an African American writer, and this is a phrase from her autobiography written in 1942. So that is mainly inviting us or preparing us for the novel's great sorrow, because we know how hard it is, or how hard is Whitechapel's sorrow. We know that. And the second epigraph is a poem written by W.H. Auden, and he is an English poet. And this poem, titled Atlantis, was actually written in the early 1940s. And it says, "Unless you become acquainted now with each refuge that tries to counterfeit Atlantis, how will you recognize the true?" So that particular phrase is actually, that partial stanza is actually asking us how we might learn to distinguish counterfeit goals or dreams from that of true. What do you mean by counterfeit goals? Counterfeit means something which is not real. So it's inviting mainly us to think about, or making us to think, how can we distinguish between the counterfeit Atlantis? Counterfeit means, as I told you, not real or not real counterfeit. So counterfeit goals, how can we distinguish from a not real goal or a dream to that of a true one? So we clearly know the Chapel's view and Whitechapel's view and Lydia's view, how their views are all different and how they are looking for an Atlantis. But they are all looking for an Atlantis, or they are all looking for an utopia, which is like a good world. But they finally realizes that it's illusionary, so it's not real. So that epigraph, these two epigraphs are really important, so keep those in your mind. So if you don't know that word, maybe write it down, epigraphs. So we have got two epigraphs, and as I told you, epigraph is a quote at the beginning of the piece of the writing. Now when you look into the text, the first one is more like a prologue, and it is mainly Whitechapel protagonist internal monologue. And it starts like this: the future is just, I'm just going to highlight bits and pieces for you. The future is just more of the past waiting to happen. Why do you think De Guer has started like this? I think it is mainly to indicate that, or the beginning is actually confronting us directly with what could be the recurring theme for slaves. For slaves, it is actually like this: the future is just more of the past waiting to happen. It's like a recurrent repetition. It also expresses Whitechapel's personal sense of hopelessness, his grief and bitterness. His futility or hopelessness is actually shown through that sentence. The future is just more of the past waiting to happen. "You do not want to know my past, nor do you want to know my name, for the simple reason that I have none, and would have to make it up to please you. What my eyes says," and again, when he says, "I have none, I have no name, I have none," that is also really important. He is actually renouncing his own identity, and he says, "I have got none. I haven't got. I don't have a name, and would have to make it up to please you. What my eyes say has never been true. All these years of my life are in my hands, not in these eyes or even in his head, even in this head. I woke up one day before the estate stood, tip-topped over my workmates, former playmates and bedfellows, and everything else to do with robbed intimacy. Unlatched the door, confronted a damp starlit morning, and decided that from this day I had no name. Again, he says that from that day onwards, he has decided that he have got no name. I was just boy, mule, nigger, slave, or whatever else anyone choose to call me. So that actually shows that he has lost his identity. He hasn't got a name. He has lost his identity completely, and that's why he says that I haven't got a particular name. I'm just a boy or a mule or a nigger or a slave or whatever anyone else chose to call me. I've been called many other things besides. My eyes are bloodshot and rheumy. I have not been crying. I don't do that anymore. The last time I cried was over the pointless death of a boy I loved as my own. Again, he is indicating about his adopted son Chapel. I swore it would be the last time because it hurt more than any pain I would felt before or since. I never knew crying could egg. I never knew crying could take over a body so rock it, shake it, rattle it, and thump it so that the body feels wrecked and cries without tears or movement of any kind, out of sheer exhaustion, except for the moan, groan, hoarse, bass wail. That was me over the whipping of a boy who had to know better somehow and would have learned with a good talking to or even a beating in these circumstances, but not this, not this. I don't want to remember. Again, he emphasizes that he doesn't want to remember all the past things that has happened. Memory hurts. Whitechapel stresses on memory, and he says memory actually hurts. It's like crying, but still and deep. Memory rises to the skin, then I can't then I can't be touched. So memory, even if he is trying hard to forget it, memory just rises to the skin that can't be touched. I hurt all over. My bones ache. My teeth loosen in their gums. My nose bleeds. Don't make me remember. I forget as hard as I can. So here he is trying to suppress his memory. He's trying to suppress the rising flood of memory. So Digwear also indicates through this prologue that forgetting is actually impossible, or it is very difficult to forget. And look at the painful and agonized tone. So the whole thing is actually painful and agonized, very painful and agonized tone. Painful, agonized, or melancholic tone. Again, the theme of memory as pain is actually introduced immediately. And also its corollary. What do you mean by its corollary? The practical consequence that actually follows, which comes naturally. So what is the corollary of memory? What is the practical consequence that follows memory? It's forgetting. So the importance of forgetting. And in order to enable survival in the face of human trauma and extreme pain, he needs to forget. And that's what Whitechapel is trying to do. He's trying to forget as hard as he can. So when you think about the prologue, it's mainly Whitechapel's internal monologue. He is talking about his own pain. And at the very beginning, he says that the text shows that the nicknames may be used to include or exclude people, especially when he says boy, mule, nigger, slave, etc. That also indicates racism. So here it indicates racism. So keep all these points in your mind when you read the prologue. So as I told you, this is also an internal monologue. This is an internal monologue by the slave Whitechapel. Now when you move into chapter 1, which is again Whitechapel's chapter, Whitechapel the slave, that morning I faced the world for the first time as a nobody, nameless. Again, look at the words that he is using. I am nobody, nameless. Because I had no name, I was able to return to my body-shaped space on the straw mat on the floor, clear a few limbs out of the way and sleep so deep. I was the last to rise when before I would lie there and listen to others breathe, snore, talk in their sleep, cry out, whimper, shield their heads from a blow, contract their bodies to receive a lash, kick and punch as if bloodhounds were upon them, grind their teeth so loud it sounded like two huge stones rubbed together, whiny like horses and bray like mules, grunt like hogs, howl like wolves, or just pain die with a gasp. So here, look at that paragraph. It's actually a run-on sentence. What do you mean by run-on sentence? Run-on sentence. It's like a continuous sentence. Run-on sentence. And this is mainly a style. It's a stream of conscience style. Stream of consciousness. Stream of consciousness. So it's a stream of consciousness style of writing. It's actually a literary style. Stream of consciousness is actually a literary style in which the character's thoughts, feelings, and reactions are actually depicted in a very continuous flow without any kind of interruption. So that's why I told you from the very beginning of that sentence. It's a long sentence. It's a run-on sentence, and it's mainly used to show the grief that Whitechapel has in his own mind. And again, look at the highlighted phrase when Digo has said, like horses, like mules. So he is actually comparing, he is equating himself. He equates being a slave with being an animal, or like an animal, arguing that slaves must have no identity. We are like animals, and actually that highlights the dehumanizing nature. It actually highlights the dehumanizing nature of slavery. Dehumanizing nature of slavery is actually shown here by Digo. Dehumanizing nature of slavery. So grief of Whitechapel, and we could hear the grief, or we could imagine the grief of Whitechapel, how overwhelmed the narrator is, and we could look at the action words. There are so many action words. It says breathe. Sorry, I was meant to highlight it. Breathe. So many action words. Snore, talk, cry out, whimper, shield. So there are so many action words. So pain and anguish is actually shown through the style of stream of consciousness style. I did things, and again there are so many repetition of verbs, as I told you, action words: breathe, talk, sleep, cry, whimper, shield. There are so many action words. The repetition of the verb. So the repetition of verbs have actually been used in order to show the pain and anguish undergone by Whitechapel the slave. I did this going to sleep last and waking first routine for too long. The bags under my eyes are sacks of worries. The bags under my eyes are sacks of worries. Again, that's a metaphor. Witnesses of dreams, nightmares, and sleeps from which a man should not be allowed to wake. The last breath is not exhaled as the body releases its hold on life and bones relax into the shape of sleep. That is wrong. The last breath is fought for. Air is sucked in. The chest heaves and swells with the effort. The eyes are flung open as the dreamer realizes this dream of death is real and his last. He literally wakes up. Again, he is referring to Chapel, his son. He literally wakes from sleep, startled that this breath is final, and instead of relief, he registers fear, more akin to surprise. So we could see the fear in Chapel. Had he been prepared by some marvelous counsel, then he would have welcomed this last breath as if he were being fed honey and died with his eyes closed and a smile on his lips. But the fight for air instills panic. The thing we have talked over countless times as our only salvation creeps upon us and catches us by surprise. All the laughing we did over it becomes the last laugh, death's last laugh. So the theme of death, my feeling is mixed. The breath should have been mine. Why must I be the witness to something I deserve more than anyone on this plantation? I have seen enough for one life, several lives. Why do you think he is saying that? Because he is almost 100 years old. I forget if I have dreamed an experience or really remember it. I put most collection down to fantasy. The boy of mine, again reference to Chapel, the boy of mine was not whipped to death for running away, for getting nowhere, not even to the next town. He jumped into my head in a whipping scene because I would sat through too many to recall with exact order, and sat because each stroke of the whip buckled my legs from under me and drained me of every ounce of my energy just to watch without sound with my hands over my eyes. If I look away, I risk inviting a beating. So I look with these bloodshot. So look at those words or those phrases. If I look away, I risk inviting a beating. So that means that he was forced to do, or he was forced. Whitechapel, the slave, the adopted father, was forced to watch his son being punished. And look how De Gore is presenting a dehumanizing view of life as a slave. They not only have to undergo severe things, severe punishment, and even they are forced to look into it and forced to watch again his own son being punished. So I look with these bloodshot eyes that I see without seeing, witness without registering a memory or sensation. The boy's 200 lashes, again, he got 200 lashes. That was a punishment that was given to the slaves who actually run away from the plantation. And Chapel too got that. The boy's 200 lashes lasted no more than 20 minutes, but he was gone halfway into it all. I saw when he switched from screaming at each blow, tensing his body for the next, screaming on impact again, relaxing his body for a moment to catch his breath, then groan, and then tensing again. Sometimes he would tense too late. The whip seemed to cause the nerves to tighten, as if it imbued the body with life rather than draining the life away. His screams were louder then, and simultaneously a little weaker than before. That's when I learned how to live without being hurt by life, sensation, this witnessing of things taxing. I literally saw the boy surrender to that whip. Again, moment of giving up. We could see, I literally saw the boy surrender to that whip. Those blows, the whole rhythm of lash, pose, lash, and tense, breathe, tense. I saw it in his eyes. They looked at us all for one last time, and clouded, misted, glazed themselves. For the rest of the beating, we begged with greater intensity and risked ourselves for him to be spared, because we had all seen him cross from our world to the next, indicates his death. But when his name was called, he always answered clearly and nodded, which was taken as good grounds to assume the punishment. So if the boy was responding, they would punish him again. The whip ate into him. Look at the phrase, the whip ate into him, but like all gluttons who have gorged themselves to their fill, it bit and chewed without swallowing, and simply bit and chewed some more, until its mouth was so full that food seeped out its corners to make room for more. The whip fed on him until the count reached 200. So look at the personification. Look at the personification there. The whip ate into him. Personification. The whip ate into him. The whip fed on him. So again, all these shows the brutality of punishment. Boy is actually being devoured by or swallowed by the whip. The boy is being fed on. The whip fed on him until the count reached 200. So it actually increases the emotions in the reader, especially the modern reader. So until the count reached 200. We cut him down and called his name throughout, and he found something somewhere to nod and answer, just as before, but his look was distant, removed from the events perpetrated on his body. Not in the least, not in the least bit interested in our fuss and worry and open grief for him. I took on his son from that moment. We dressed his back with balm that took away feeling and stopped blood in its tracks. We talked to him and he nodded, but he stopped answering to his name. Then his head hardly moved. Then not at all. All his eyes, which remained the same, told us nothing. That is how I know that he was gone halfway into the beating when he stopped screaming "Father," because he could see I was being held down and was no good for him again. That phrase, I was being held down and was no good to him. And was no good to him. So actually, he is. It's that moment when Chapel, the son, is realizing that father is no good for him. Father is not even helping him, and the fact is that he couldn't do anything. He couldn't do anything. So there's a sense of regret. The eyes became less wide and still, and the tears that continued to stream from them did so in steady flow, whereas before they seemed to appear in floods as the whip tore into him again. Another personification, whip tore into him. I closed those eyes, for one last look at them. I said sorry and closed them and turned away from them into that exact look in my own eyes. I was crying up till then, uncontrollably during the whipping. Then, as I tended his back, almost noiselessly, in order to steady my hand, whose touch made his flesh recoil, and we know that it's very painful when someone touches wood. My hand is not the whip's son. And look at that phrase of his father. He says that as a sense of regret, Whitechapel actually reveals his new effort to distinguish himself from authority and obedience, now knowing that collaborating with the master does not actually bring any kind of justice or protection. At this moment, he understood that being at the side of the authority or being loyal to the authority doesn't help him or his son. I said, or imagined saying to him. He nodded to everything, then nothing. I had to have no name to match this look and the remainder of this life. I had to have no name to match this look and the remainder of this life. So that is the reason why he hasn't got a name. So it's more like a self-imposed namelessness. It's more like a self-imposed. He decided to more like a self-imposed namelessness. So he has decided to renounce his name because I had to have no name to match this look. So it's more like a self-imposed namelessness. Surface, they call me. There are lines, two of them, on each side of my mouth, turned down lines. Two short strokes that run from the corner of my lips down my chin, as deep as any scar, as deep as any scar. Again, look at the simile, as deep as any scar, but earned over nights for lying awake, staring at the dark, and the dark staring back unblinkingly, and listening to the hut turning in its sleep, and then hearing the turns without thinking turn, because the looking and listening had become numb, and the brain had emptied itself, gone numb too, as a result of so much hard attention to nothing and everything. Now, won't be able to read the whole thing, but look at the way he is describing. And worry cut those paths in my face, and he says that it's because of the worry that he is getting the scars on his face. Constant moaning and crying is actually giving marks on his face. I let it happen because I didn't feel it happening and only knew it was there when someone called me sour face one day. And I looked in the mirror for evidence and found plenty staring back at me. What was I before this? I forget. Did I smile? Laugh out loud? Don't recall. What is that? I think of a donkey brain. That is like a big laugh, involuntary, involving the whole body, noisy and long and toothy. What could lead to such behavior? There is nothing in my past to make me brave. Knowing this, I can say I will never laugh again. If I ever did, sour face, that's me. Not dead eyes, not black head, not ancient, though I have earned sufficient. So that indicates that he has got lots of names. People call him different names. Again, we could see very choppy sentences, not dead. Choppy sentences we could see here. Not dead eyes, not black head, not ancient. Very choppy sentences. And why do you think that choppy sentence is being used? Choppy sentences. Mainly to show the sense of anguish. To show the sense of anguish. But sour face, the lines were chiseled there without any permission. Thinking things over, I see now how I made my life harder than it needed to be, longer than necessary. Again, there is a brief indication to the title of the story, longer than necessary. So he thinks that I see now I have made my life harder than it needed to be, on longer than necessary. My face says life is sour, a life that was fresh to begin with, but one left out too long turned to this, counting the hours that drag through the dark, biding the minutes that hop and shift and hobble along the days. Now, next paragraph. I've buried 2 wives and most of my children. Buried 2 wives and most of my children. I'm surrounded my grandchildren and great-grandchildren. They think I'm a Judas and an old man who can make a great pepper stew when guarded to do so. They leave me alone most of the time. Again, loneliness. Why do you think the family members leave him alone? Because it is he actually who revealed that Chapel has gone to the north. Chapel has escaped through the river path, and as a result, people call him as a betrayer. People compares him to Judas. You know that in Bible, Judas is actually the betrayer. Judas, the betrayer. Betrayer. He's the one who betrays Jesus. Same way here, they think I'm Judas. So there is a comparison, or there is a biblical imagery here of Judas comparing himself to Judas, who had actually betrayed Jesus. Same way, just like Judas betrayed Jesus, he believes, or Whitechapel believes, that he has actually, or his family members actually believe that Whitechapel has betrayed his own son, which is not the fact really. So don't forget about the biblical imagery there. They think I'm a Judas and an old man who can make a great pepper stew. Now, next paragraph. One of them ran into me once. We both rounded the same corner of the house, thinking it was river flowing one way. I was going at any minute pace. He was running full pelt from a stick wielded by someone with authority over. He knocked me off my feet. So he's again talking about the grandchildren, and he says that one of the grandchildren actually knocked him off, and I rolled for several yards before stopping face up in the stars. He carried on running, and the stick bearer came over to me and helped me to my feet. That knock that brought out stars in broad daylight recurs. I walk from corners I can't see through, though I have never met anyone in that way. Suddenly, so that whole thing, he knocked me off. He carried on me running, and the stick bearer came over to me and helped me to my feet. Again, family is really angry that all those small incidents shows that family doesn't care for him. Family actually is angry because they feel that it is Whitechapel who has betrayed Chapel and who has made him, or who is the reason for Whitechapel to die. And as a result, towards the middle of the paragraphs, we could see that my grandchildren started calling me sit down, grandfather. I liked that more than sour face, and he says that he loved that name more than the sour face. And he constantly compares himself to. They would laugh. I mean, like a donkey, I can't laugh, so I would shake my head at their pleasure and at how easy a laugh came to them just by looking at them. So basically, they are trying to mock and ridicule Whitechapel, the slave. Perhaps I laughed with my first wife and daughters, and my second wife and our son, if not with their children and their children's children. They laugh at me. Again, not reading the whole thing. There are so many things to say and so many things. Sour face, dead sour mouth is contagious. Again, short, sharp sentences. Dead eyes turn to stone. Very short and sharp sentences. Short, sharp sentences. Again, that so many choppy sentences are there. Obstacle, burden, laughing stock. So many choppy sentences. Again, as I told you before, that is the style, a stream of consciousness, stream of consciousness style. Stream of consciousness. As I told you, stream of consciousness means it's just flowing. Whatever comes to his mind, he's just saying it. Even if it's a choppy sentence, a short word, or a one phrase, still he says that, and that's stream of consciousness style. So I'm just scrolling again. All right. When I sit, it will be for no more. I will not rise and dust my pants off and shake my head at the pleasure given to someone else at my expense. My wife will call, and I will answer her the one way I know how, in silence and with a gesture. Now that we speak across the years, without words, across the darkness of his life and her death, she asks me to hold her. A slow death that took so long I willed it to come, get its work done, and get out of my life. My son held for me. Again, this is all about Cook on her deathbed. And it says that a slow death that he doesn't, just like any other husbands, he doesn't want his wife to die, but still she was suffering a lot, and that's the reason why he's asking, or he's begging for a quick death. My son held her for me. He looked away to hide his wet eyes, and again we could see Chapel crying. He looked away to hide his wet eyes. I leaned to her with my ears, brushing her nose and mouth to bear her last wish. She said, "Don't keep me waiting too long." And I finished her sentence for her. She got as far as two in her breathy sentence, and I said, "Long." But she said nothing in reply, and my son looked at us with a jerk of his head, and I knew she was dead. So that is the death of Cook. The next day, the next dawn, especially the next morning when he was gone, who was gone? Chapel was gone. So immediately after the death of Cook, Chapel left the plantation. So next dawn, so don't forget about when did he left the plantation. Next dawn, next morning, he was gone. And by dusk that same day, what happened? On that same day, dusk, he was caught, and before night set in, he had joined his mother with me, leaning over him because he was too heavy to hold or cradle. As I imagined, I must have cradled him when he was young. I promised her I wouldn't be long, but I sent my son in my place less than a full day later. See, look at this. I promised. So Whitechapel says that I promised Cook I wouldn't be long, which means that he will die, and he will join Cook as soon as possible. But instead of he himself going, who was sent? His son, Chapel. I sent, and again look at the word I sent. That that again shows that it was actually Whitechapel who was responsible. So it's more like his own responsibility. It was he who was actually responsible for the death of his son. I promised her I wouldn't be long, but I sent my son in my place less than a full day later. Not even a full day has gone. I have sent my own son. Now I can't die because I can't face her blaming me for sending him ahead of me or in my place or at all. So again, Whitechapel is actually worried about Cook blaming him for sending his own son so quick to death. My ears since her death and his are stolen, cowardly seen through, bloody eyes felt with numb skin and aching bones, tail-haired, black in the sky and hard in the heart and sour in the mouth. Now I'm just skipping bits and pieces. One day, where is that? One day, I'm here. One day I know I will see them, and they will be the last thing I see. And sit down, grandfather will be no more, and glad because of it. And a smile might turn up my turned down mouth. Something approximate the beginning of a donkey's bray might escape my lips if anything. Again, here he is actually longing for death. He feels that he deserves death. I know I will see them, and they will be the last thing I see, and sit down, grandfather will be no more. So that actually shows that he's actually longing for death. He longs for death. Longing for death. Whitechapel is longing for death. He feels he deserves death. He feels he deserves death. To my mind, a simple lesson in obedience was all that my boy required. Again, Whitechapel believes that. To my mind, a simple lesson in obedience was all that my boy Chapel required. He needed to know his situation sooner rather than later. I believed some punishment would do him good because it would keep him alive. So why do you think Whitechapel has revealed about the whereabouts of his son? Because he believed that some kind of punishment would actually do some kind of good for him, and that will help him alive by driving from his wild head once and for all any notion of freedom from responsibility. So Chapel was always a rebel. He wanted that freedom. He was aiming or hoping for freedom. He was born owned by another man, like his father before him, and like his son would be born again. Look at that. That actually shows the generational he was born owned by another man like his father before him, and that actually shows the generational system of slavery, that they have been like that. So system of slavery, generational system of slavery, generational system of slavery, because he was owned by another man like his father before him, and like his son would be born. So this sounds straightforward enough. But for the increasing number of runaways, you wouldn't think so. Where do runaways go when they don't get caught? I always pose this question to the young because I can see their dreams as plain as their color and youth on their faces. Paradise is the answer, so they always say that they wanted to go to paradise. Paradise is where they wanted to go to. Paradise, damn right, I shout. When they are captured by the trackers, they are consigned to paradise, sent there forthwith. Free at last, but not free to tell us anything about it. Run from here, you die. So if you're running from the plantation, you die. My boy listened to my careful reasoning. He shook his head negatively, but had the grace to keep quiet and walk away. I knew he put my argument down to old age or cowardice or both. So here we could actually see that paradise here, paradise, what the young people like Chapel believes is paradise is like paradise is the answer, like a heaven on earth. On earth itself, there is a heaven. And for Chapel and for Lydia, that paradise is northern part, where there is no slavery, where slavery is abolished. So for them, of when they say paradise, they actually means paradise on earth. But the irony is that when they are caught by the trackers, they actually are gone to paradise. Actual paradise is heaven. When do we go to heaven? When we die. So actual the actual paradise. So that contrast or that irony of that paradise, the paradise in Chapel's mind is the paradise or the heaven on earth, whereas for the trackers, or when Whitechapel says paradise, yes, they go back to paradise, because when the trackers catch them, they just die. So run from here and you die. My boy listened. He didn't, so actually he listened, but he didn't say anything. I knew he put my argument down to old age or cowardice. So here Chapel actually disagrees. We could see that Chapel is a rebel, and Chapel disagrees with his father. Chapel disagrees with his father. Father was blindly accepting, or his philosophy was being very loyal to be a loyal slave, but young people like Chapel was actually rebel, and they wanted to go and find the paradise, or they wanted to go to the paradise. I must have watched him walk away, still shaking his head as if to empty it of my words, and decided then that he needed to learn for himself. I knew the cost of such a lesson. So here he says again that I knew the cost of such a lesson. It's not an easy lesson. I decided then that he needed to learn for himself. So at that moment when Chapel didn't listen to Whitechapel, actually Whitechapel decided that no, he need to learn a lesson for himself, and he actually knew the cost of such a lesson. The risk was obvious to me, and yet the schooling in the idea of subservience, obedience, and compliance was different for each of us. It was my view that a slave could live good life. Again, that is an important quote. He says, it was my view that a slave could live good long life if he worked hard and presented to his master the most dignified aspect of himself, in order to reciprocate the same manner from the master, the same civility, fairness, and even kindness, once the relationship grew warm and cordial. So here for him, for Whitechapel, that is his philosophy. That is Whitechapel's philosophy. This is Whitechapel's philosophy or belief. What is his philosophy? He believes that if a slave, it is my view that a slave could live a good life, a long life. How? If he worked hard, and if he presented to his master the most dignified aspect of himself, if he is being very nice and respectful to his master, he will be, or the master will be reciprocating, giving back the same manner from that, will be getting that same kind of respect, the same civility and fairness and even kindness once the relationship grew warm and cordial. And that is Whitechapel's philosophy. That's how Whitechapel has been living for a long time. He is almost 100. So Whitechapel's philosophy is actually made him to live long. That's what he says. And again, look at the word when he says slave. He calls himself slave. He says that a slave could live a good life, and he himself categorizes himself as slave. That actually suggests that he accepts the racist ideology. He is a person who accepts racist ideology, that blacks are somehow meant to be slaves. So it's more like illusory trust in the system of slavery. He is trusting, and that trust is actually illusory. Illusory trust. Illusory trust in the system of slavery. Blindly he is trusting the system of slavery, thinking that their masters will reciprocate the same kind of kindness as if they do. So that's really important. And then towards the end of that paragraph, but I realized that when he shook off my reasoning and restored his own faulty dreams, that I would have to save him from himself with a lesson. Now, I was distracted by the bedridden demise of his young mother. Again, jumping back in time, going back in, as I told you, this is not no whole novella is not in the chronological order. It's not in the linear order. It jumps back and forth. So here, the jumps back in time. I was distracted by the bedridden demise of his young mother, Cook. The fever dried her up. Still, she resembled me in years. She was on the verge of this world and the next. She needed constant attention. I was relieved of most of my duties by the master, who informed the overseer to allow me time to attend to her needs. And again, that is important. I was relieved of most of my duties by the master, who informed the overseer to allow me time to take care of his wife. So Whitechapel actually believes that the owner, Mr. Whitechapel, is actually kind, suggests master's kindness, because it's more like a patronizing view there. So patronizing the master. So it's like a patronizing view or a patronizing tone, and suggests that master is actually suggests master's kindness. Master was kind enough to say to the overseer that Whitechapel needed to take care of his wife, so that relieve him from his duties. Who could get the degree of consideration? Who could get the degree of consideration shown them but someone who had managed to elicit the kindness and fairness of another? So now Whitechapel is actually asking who else will get such kind of a kindness and fairness, and he once again emphasizes that he is getting these kinds of fairness only because of his philosophy of being loyal to his master. Again, the talk with my son, my decisions receded from my mind. My wife lost all sense of time and was constant in her distress. Her pain from the lower region of back, so all about his wife's sickness. I could not convince, but what happened later? I could not convince the master to pay for the physician to look after her, but he did argue and convince me that her time had come, and not everyone was able to become an ox like me. So here it is actually clear that he says that he doesn't even receive, or this person, who is this? Cook doesn't even deserve a doctor. I could not convince the master to pay for a physician to look at her, but instead, what did he argue? What did the master argue and convince him? That her time had come, and not everyone was able to become like an old ox like me, refers to Whitechapel. This seemed acceptable, so I set about to make her last days comfortable. And again, look at the why Whitechapel says this seemed acceptable according to Whitechapel. That was acceptable. So again, this seemed acceptable. He accepts his own because of his own inferiority complex, or he actually accepts it, and he says that he thinks that okay, that's the maximum a master could do to help a slave. I set about to make her last days comfortable. The hours took their toll. When she died, I was exhausted. My son was gone before I missed him. It was out of my hands, or it seemed, until I realized unless I did something, he would be in paradise with his mother and his broken body left in a gully somewhere to him. So, as I told you, immediately after the death of Cook, the next day he Chapel went, and I did something, he would be in paradise, until I realized unless I did something, he would be in paradise with his mother. And that is the reason why Whitechapel acted. That would have been his fate if I had washed my hands of my responsibility to him. I could not. The overseer had left with a party of hungry men, some hours before in pursuit. He did not even bother to question me. As soon as I heard my son was gone, my only son, the son I had reasoned with and who had rejected my reasoning, I knew what I had to do. Again, Whitechapel talks about the two types of slaves. There are two types of slaves. He says a slave who must experience everything for himself, and before coming to understanding of anything, he would learn through observation. So the slave in the first category and he who learns, so there are two types. One is the first category where everything, a slave who must experience everything, need to learn a lesson through their experience before coming to an understanding of anything. And the second category is he who learns through observation. So the slave in the first category behaves as if he is the only slave in the world and is visited by the worst luck on earth. That type of slave is agitated and brings much trouble on his head, and he makes the lot of every slave 10 times worse. It is generally accepted that slave in the second category is brighter, lives longer, because everyone around him a minimum of worries and earns the small kindness of overseer and the master. Okay, so there are two types, and we know that the first category of slave is, who is the first category? Chapel, because he won't learn until he experiences it. So first category of slave here is representing Chapel. But it is generally accepted, look at the second one. It is generally accepted that the slave in the second category is brighter, lives longer, and what else? Brighter, lives longer, causes everyone around him minimum of worries, and earns a small kindness of the overseer and the master. And who do you think that second category is? Or who represents that second category? Whitechapel, the father. People like Whitechapel, they are very accepting, and they are accepting all the punishments and everything, and that kind of category is bright and lives long. And Whitechapel says that I realized my son was in the first troublesome category. Obviously, Chapel, his son, was in the first troublesome category. That day he walked away from my advice. A bolt of lightning shot through my heart. My heart beat, rattled like the start of a rain. Again, there are so many techniques. I've got no time to talk about all that. But still, when I see something, again, this is a simile. My heart rattled like the start of a rain. Yeah. My heartbeat rattled like the start of rain on a roof before steadying again with the rhythm of downpour. I resolved to save my son, not to abandon him. Again, this is the moment where Whitechapel is deciding to save his son, not to abandon him to the horrible fate he might bring on himself. So the news that he had run some hours earlier brought me to the master's front door. So as a result, Whitechapel goes to the master's front door. And who is the master? Mr. Whitechapel. The door to his two private rooms upstairs in his house for the first time in my life. Mr. Whitechapel emerged half-dressed, surprised at my boldness. Again, look at the way master is surprised at his boldness. Just going and talking to him is actually not even beyond their it's beyond their I don't know what to say, beyond their responsibility, beyond their it's more like limited to them. They were not allowed to do that. So why Mr. Whitechapel was actually surprised at his boldness and irritated and intrigued by the same time. So look at the reaction or the interaction between master and slave. He was actually irritated, intrigued, He assumed his customary pose, and again the way he stands, left hand on his hip, right hand crackling a pipe that jutted from his mouth like an extra organ. Simile there. I begged his pardon, wished God's blessing. I begged pardon. Like, look at the first sentence. I begged his pardon. Again, being very implosive. There is no need of begging. There is no need of begging pardon. And then he wished God's blessing on him and his 2 sons and 1 daughter and a good wife. He cut me short and asked me what I would have him to do with a runaway among his good Negroes. He cut me short and asked me what I would have him to do with a runaway among his good Negroes, poisoning their minds on a daily basis. I said that he need not worry about my son because my proposal would ensure a compliant, obedient serf who had made one impulsive indiscretion. He asked me again what I would have him to do. I looked at him for the first time in our exchange. He was distracted and exasperated. He had never been like this with me before in all the years I had served him. I said I would pray for him and his family as I have always prayed. I begged him, again, look at the phrase, I begged him to send a man after the search party to ensure my son's return and safe and just punishment. He said events were now out of his control and in God's hand, again blaming God for everything, or changing the responsibility to God. God was just and fair, and I should accept his judgment on us all. I agreed and took a breath to plead my case, but he interceded with the question, did I seek to contradict this assessment? I said no, and again took a breath to reason this dilemma to a fair conclusion. Again, he interrupted me by repeating his question, this time with more volume and a degree of anger that was clearly intended to silence me. Again, look at the anger. I bowed. He turned on his heels and I spoke. So the whole interaction highlights the gap in the right and the power and the interest, or the gap between the slave and master. So that all of that indicates a gap between slave and master. Sir, I know where my son is. So this is at this moment, Whitechapel is actually confessing, and he says that I know where my son is. Whitechapel's confession, and it's at this moment Whitechapel is actually, they stopped him and spun him around to bring him face to face with me as before. So this is the moment of confession. He confesses. Whitechapel confesses about the whereabouts of Chapel. Where, man, speak up. He was furious and appeared to judge my knowledge of my son's whereabouts as some form of power over him, my master. This was cause enough for me to breathe deeply and cherish the air in his quarters. Again, skipping some sentences, my son believes there is a place called paradise. Now, Whitechapel says that my son actually believes there is a place called paradise on earth. He has gone to find it. He has done what the young reason to be their prerogative because they are blessed with youth that is impetuous and be damned. He is my only son. So he's basically saying that please spare my son. He is my only son. Where in hell's name is he, Whitechapel? My name was bellowed out. Again, look at the anger. And I'm skipping some line, and he says he has taken the river path. I beg for leniency. He's grieving for his mother. And again, he's stressing the fact that my son, don't punish him. Please, I beg for leniency because he's actually grieving for the death of his mother. My master gave orders to a man to catch the trackers and redirect them to the river. Mr. Whitechapel added that my son was not to be harmed in any way, since an example would be made of him to see all and learn by. He turned on his heels. And then he's leaving. So he basically says that Mr. Whitechapel is giving the orders not to harm his son, but everyone need to learn a lesson. It was the best I could hope for, my son's safe return. That was only his intention, son's safe return. But the house slaves cast me such disdainful looks. Look at the slaves, the other slaves who might be related to Whitechapel. They're showing such disdainful look. Why do you think so? Because they believe that I have thrown my son to the lions. They knew and loved him from his early years spent around the master's house when his mother was its cook. They did not understand. They had no one to save, perhaps the house and had become theirs as much as their master's. I cast that look back to as many of them as possible until I opened the door into the yard and found I could breathe again. They were breathing the master's expelled air and perfume and had become so accustomed to it that any source drawing upon the master's disapproval received theirs too. They seemed angry at me. They seemed as angry at me for annoying him as for the fact that I had betrayed the whereabouts of my son. So that is the reason why the family members or the other slaves, the related um, slaves, were actually angry at him because they all felt like he has thrown his son to the lions. Now all I could do was wait. My master delayed. His master was about to go to north with his family and guest until the trackers returned with my son. Mr. Whitechapel was to accompany them to the next town and return with his second son, William. William is the second son, leaving his wife and younger daughter in the capable hands of his elder son, Thomas. I could do nothing but walk about the plantation, sticking close to the main road up to the house. So they were about to go. I'm skipping some lines. The master threw up his arms as he emerged from the house with his family and guest. It was early afternoon. He said he could not delay his departure for Fredericksburg with his guest another minute, otherwise they would be on the road in the dark. He issued orders, again he is issuing orders, that my son to be locked up to wait punishment when he returned. Those were his parting words to the deputy, and he gave that order to the deputy. He gave that order to the deputy. The deputy heard the order in the company of 4 slaves, myself included. I was the 5th. Why my heart sank then I know now, but at that time I thought I'm foolish, my alarm foolish and misplaced. How many times had the master left the plantation, having issued orders that were carried out to the letter? See, Mr. Whitechapel has ordered not to punish him, and that was his parting words to the deputy. And the deputy actually heard this in front of 4 slaves, and Whitechapel was actually the 5th slave who witnessed or who heard the orders of the master. Dusk crept on the plantation and stole into the hall. Look at the beautiful personification there. They've got personification there. Personification. Before I knew it, give me a second. Yeah, there we go. They returned to the. I wanted to see my son. I knew they were returning for either 2 reasons, so he could see or he could hear the trackers coming back. They had succeeded either they had succeeded in apprehending my son, or they were forced to call off the hunt because of failing light. And then he prays that God let it be the first. They might have caught him. And then I'm skipping some lines. Okay, before that, yes. There was a moment when peace sprouted arms, legs ahead, and a flick of the face of my son. Open-mouthed, tear-stained, bruised, but alive. So they caught Chapel, his son. Open-mouthed, tear-stained, bruised, but he was alive. I rushed to him. He turned his body and face away from me, and I knew that he must have heard I would have given him up. So that's more like a physical rejection. Son is physically rejecting the dad, physical rejection, thinking that he is the one who has betrayed. I was pushed out of the path, and again, for here before me was my son in chains. So they brought the son in chains, led and dragged in turn like a wild beast of the forest which had been plugged. Again, there is a simile there. My son, whose dreams were such that he argued his children would be free, his children. So again, he was the one who has been arguing about abolishing slavery. I admit he spoke in rash manner during our exchange. When I said that his place in life was the same place occupied by me and available to his children, I countered then that evidence of 300 years was against his view and ratified mine. He then walked away and shook off my words much as a drenched dog shakes off water. And again, Here he was paraded for his wrongheadedness, proving he belonged to the type of people who learn through expensive first-hand mistakes. Only I could save him. And Whitechapel believed that only he could actually save his son. In my judgment, I did save him when I went to the owner of this plantation that runs as far as an eye can see, the owner of every living soul on it, human, animal, plant, and mineral. I got my master to order that my son be spared from all mere manner of punishment until his return. I did this, I, nameless, sour-faced, sit-down father, yet he turned his back on me, my son. See, so here Whitechapel is trying to say that I have done everything. I have done everything to help him. I have been asking and begging to the master, so I have done everything to help him. Now the overseer fired orders at everyone. I looked for his deputy. He was nowhere in sight, so the deputy was missing. The deputy was the one who heard the order from Master, Mr. Whitechapel, but he was missing. I called on all my relation to find him so that he could confirm the master's orders concerning the well-being of my son. They ran off calling the overseer Mr. Santos. So Mr. Santos Jr. is this overseer. Asked me what the fuss was about. I said that before he made another move, he should hear the master's words from his deputy, who was about to be fetched to him. He asked where I thought his deputy would be at this time, except where he had been every night for the last several months. I said nothing but shook my head and searched my brain for a clue to this puzzling question. The slaves came back nearly at once, and I could see the answer to the overseer's question on their face. His deputy had married some months earlier and had taken to disappearing his wife's their cottage some 5 miles from the plantation. So the deputy is not on scene. He has gone to visit his wife, newly married. The master knew nothing of this. As far as he was concerned, his overseer's deputy had weakened to go off the plantation and visit his wife, not every evening. Tonight he set off, even though the master has issued him specific orders. A slave attached to the house said the deputy had left on the assumption that my son would not be caught, at least not tonight. Mr. Santos uttered something about orders from the master concerning the well-being of slaves can only come to him second-hand from his deputy. It would not be in the interest of a slave to repeat orders detrimental to his comfort. I said those orders concerning my son were witnessed by 4 others beside myself, and it was my duty to inform him of them. He ordered me to shut up or be bashed. Again, racism and cruelty, dehumanization. Overseer is actually ordering Whitechapel to shut up. Many other obscenities were uttered by him into my face. Again, racial discrimination. He had cut his foot badly and was in a degree of pain. Exhaustion from the day's tracking shadowed his face, but no amount of personal discomfort merited his kind of exchange. Again, he raised his hand and his knuckles stung my left ear and temple, so overseer is actually hitting Whitechapel there. I stumbled less from the blow than from the fact of it. Some 30 years ago, a similar blow was directed at me. 30 years ago, a similar blow was directed at me. A mere slave got that overseer, Mr. Santos' father, in fact. So even 30 years before, he got the same kind of blow from his father, Mr. Santos Jr.'s father, Mr. Santos Sr. A severe reprimanding from the previous master, my present master's father. So mention about his master. 30 years ago, I managed it, then I would do it again. A silence fell in the yard. My son looked at me and lunged for Mr. Santos. So when Mr. Santos Jr. did hit Whitechapel, my son looked at me and lunged for Mr. Santos. And then he shouted, he asked me what these orders concerning my son might be. I told him. He threw off his shame and donned an armor of rage. He shouted that his entire day had been eaten up with the pursuit of a renegade. He said he would faithfully return the criminal to the plantation when others would have disposed of him upon his capture. Now, My only reason for bringing back that young nigger is because the boss said he would be made an example of to discourage further runaways. My food is cut, I'm tired and hungry. Again, look at the derogatory phrase used by um, masters or overseers. Derogatory term, derisive term. There is no way the nigger is not going to face the usual punishment of his crime. Again, he says that there is no way that Chapel is going to face the same punishment for his crime. An example must be set not to punish him now in the appropriate way would be an outrage against this entire plantation. I am the overseer, and in the absence of master, I do what is best for the plantation. I do not take orders from a nigger. I don't care if you're 100 years old, you are a slave. Again, that division of slave, or that division of master and slave. Now get out of my way, or as God is my witness, I will strap you up next to your son. Again, look at the treatment. Look at how overseer treats Whitechapel, the slave. As many lashes I had been threatened with a whip, the master would hear of this. Again, I stood riveted to the spot. My son called his mother. I heard this above the clatter of 1250 plantation slaves. Again, my son called his mother, remembering. That's a kind of remembering. I grabbed the arm of the strongest kin to me, a man close to my son's age, third grandchild of the 10th of my 12 daughters. I told him to run to the 5 miles of the deputy's house, since he could only say, because he is the only one who heard the orders from the plantation owner, Mr. Whitechapel. He looked alarmed. I had forgotten. A slave discovered of the plantation at night was liable to be killed. I told him I would go myself to save my son. So Whitechapel here is ready to take the place of his son, and he said, I'm happy to take his place. He touched my arm, nodded at me, and darted into the shadows of the dusk, skulking beneath the tree. My son shouted again for his mother. I parted the crowd to get to him. She can't come to you, my son. I am here for you. So the fear, the love, that father's love. I put myself before Sanders, who frowned. My son is all I have, sir. Spare him. Let me take his place. Again, father's love. Mr. Sanders laughed aloud, brushed the air in front of his face as if to rid off a pest, and ordered that I be restrained for as long as it took to administer 200 lashes to my son. So Whitechapel has been restrained while Chapel got his lashes. When he said the number of lashes, an astonished cry rose from the crowd and filled the early evening air. Again, they begged and cried. The night was torn to ribbons by their grief. Again, very poetic description. They begged and cried. The night was torn to ribbons by their grief. Poetic description of grief. Again, towards the middle, I who have worked my life for one estate and on one family was shown no respect. So Whitechapel has been working for this plantation, and he is not getting any respect back. I was granted none. I killed my son because I wanted him next to me when I died, just as he held his heavy mother weighed by death. For me to listen to her last breath, he would hold me. And so here, actually, Whitechapel is really sad, and he feels that his own fear that he killed his son, that kind of, he blamed himself for killing his own son. And now at this moment, he is also realizing that there is no point in being loyal to the master. Nothing, that they are not receiving anything. So is that my great grandson can knock me down, discard my fallen body, leave me warden and concussed, and think nothing of it. Everyone without exception blames for me for death of my son. That is the reason why everyone is blaming, and even Whitechapel himself believed that he is the one who has killed his son. Run into me and kill me, bludgeon me with a stick, overseer. I am a common slave. There is blood on my conscience. My memory is longer than time. This is where the reference to the title comes. My memory is longer than time. I have been remembering everything. I want to forget, and again he tries his best. I don't want to see any more. I answered to dog. I want to forget. I answered to dog. My great grandchildren run towards me, and I sit down to avoid calamity. And again, he calls himself killer of children because of his intense grief. And again, it's a confused style of writing because it's constantly the grief. It's all about the grief. So, killer of children, protector of the worst fate of your people or any people. He said, what I have become the master of my fate, and the master of my fate no longer in need of control or supervision. One so accustomed to his existence that he impinges on his freedom and can be left to his own devices, a master of his own slavery, slaver, enslaver, model slave, as I told you before, sense of hopelessness and despair is actually shown throughout, again through the conscious style of stream of consciousness technique. Thinks freedom is death, thinks paradise is the afterlife, has practiced death in life for years, but death will not come, sees death in his eyes, in his mouth. So he has been practicing death, but sees death in his eyes, in his mouth, has a body bereft of laughter, sleep, love, purpose, has a body bestower of death, giver of death. He blames himself, outliving all. He is outliving all because he's 100 years. The eyes seeing them off, the sore mouth fixed in disdain, eyes and mouth seeing of a son, 10 daughters, several grandchildren, 2 wives, have nothing left to kill but themselves. The eyes turn on themselves, the mouth sneers at itself, stare and sneer, and hopefully die. But no, the mornings repeat after snatched sleep. Eyes scramble over relatives, walk into the quiet light, spreading without so much as a rustle or anything, and sit facing where the sun starts. The sun begins because it must. When will it die? Will I witness the death? Sun, see me out of this world. I have more family on that side, on that other side than this. Why does he say so? Because there are so many family members who have already been dead. Bear me to them, warm my frozen eyes, sweeten my mouth, stir in my dead loins. I will lie down here, cover me. So he's basically wishing for death. Whitechapel is actually wishing for death because he feels that at least through his death, everything he will be able to forget everything. So wishing for death. It's a long chapter.